In the early days of the Texas legislature, one of the things that happened is following the War for Independence and the establishment of the Republic of Texas, there were two conventions, constitutional conventions, that were called in Texas. One had to do with seceding from the United States after the Texas annexation. I just recently found out about this. And there were questions and qualms already concerning the annexation and what it meant for Texas to join the federal system. And part of that had to do with the fact that there were certain arrangements that the federal government put on Texas. Now, I've read through some of the legislative history, I've read through some of the commentary, I've also read through some of the remarks that are on the public record from the then governor at the time, who had previously been involved with various things connected with Texas prior to becoming governor. And one of the things that's discussed is the relationship between considerations of liability. See, what happened is, to the best of my understanding, is that when Texas agreed to join the federal government of the United States, there was a certain amount of money that had been put into a particular trust concerning some early financial arrangements the state of Texas had. And the Treasury of the United States said it was going to hold that money until, and was going to bond it with certain terms until such time as they secured from all of the people that were meant to be beneficiaries of that money waivers of liability, the equivalent of a waiver of liability or no fault, by the federal government. And once they had secured from everybody involved those findings of no fault or waivers of liability by the federal government, then they would distribute, and then they would allow for that to be given to the people of Texas that it belonged to. Well, the problem is that one of the many problems, and there's a lot that was going on, there's a lot that was contested at the time around these relationships, including some follow up to the contestation that happened with the annexation itself. And one of the major things that happened is that the Treasury changed the terms. The federal government changed the terms after the contract had already been engaged. So you get somebody to agree to certain terms, and then after, you just unilaterally change it, and then expect for them to fall in line. So Texas had to engage constitutional process in accordance with what was going on in Texas at the time and what was constitutional in Texas at the time to make a decision about how to respond. And in one of these manners, this is one of the things that contributed to a constitutional convention regarding what later ended up coming up down the road, right? And so there were two different constitutional conventions that happened in the later part of the 19th century in Texas, one of which was a constitutional convention to determine whether or not to secede from the United States. Now, I remember when I was a kid, I would hear these stories, and it said that Texas had a right to exercise its option to secede in a manner that was different than any other state in the country until a certain point in time. After a certain point in time, Texas no longer had that option. There's going to be a lot that's going to have to be re-examined about that, whether or not it's accurate. But at the same time, I contend, and I've read through a few Supreme Court cases and opinions that have spoken to this matter, and including ones that do not support the right of a state to secede. But I contend that based on what I have read, that the arguments that they're considering around justification for secession are not the same as what we're dealing with in this context. And I do believe every state has the right to call a constitutional convention to determine whether or not to secede and or whether or not to reconfigure itself in comportment with different kinds of regional or other alliances. I also, however, believe that until such time as a state actually engages in a formal process around which it discusses and determines secession, that it is not constitutionally capable of creating what would constitute a treaty with a foreign country. So, while I do think we are in a situation where this needs to be taken seriously and considered perhaps as a priority, that it's time for us to take these matters into our hands. It's time for us to go through a process of calling our own constitutional conventions. We need to be able to determine and self determine and acknowledge that the criminality that has pervaded our governmental structures is so significant that we refuse to allow the misrepresentation that there are representation, because they're not. But in the course of that, it's also important that until we take that step to repudiate and to withdraw from the federal system and the federal constitutional system as individual actors within a specific state, we are still required to acknowledge the federal government when it comes to treaty relations with foreign countries. It's one of the reasons why these BDS laws that have been enacted in all of these states in the United States are unconstitutional. It's one of the reasons why those memorandums of understanding between individual states and certain countries around certain kinds of technology sharing or around other kinds of cooperation that are in violation of federal law and or including related to interstate commerce are unconstitutional. And all of these matters are ones that we should be able to move forward on considering as constituents and as people that deserve to have appropriate representation. This is not just a matter of settling for lesser evil. Lesser evilism hasn't worked. And insofar as lesser evilism hasn't worked, we need to go through the process. And I believe and I support us going through a process where we allow for ourselves to understand we have not only a right and not only a duty, but we have the potential pleasure of self-determining outside of an obligation to others that have defrauded us and attempted to try to get us to provide insurance for their crimes. It's not acceptable. It's unconstitutional. It's already a mockery and a fraud. It's time for us to take matters into our own hands and to represent ourselves in this course of action. So I have to be honest with you. I got some information here. I'll do what I can to review what the processes were that Texas went through in the early days, determining and trying to set up those constitutional conventions to see what's applicable. I can't say that I understand what the protocol or the call down is for a specific implementation of constitutional convention, especially insofar as I believe the currently constituted government of the state of Texas and the currently constituted government of the state of the United States is under fraudulent pretenses and has been infiltrated. So this is something we as the people are going to have to need to do on our own. We're going to have to figure out a process that also comports with the constitutional principles that we seek to uphold and that we seek to allow for a representation of ourselves that's accurate. It's 4:16 on January 8th, 2020. Have a good day.